A few months ago, I made a video about my adventures with mechanical keyboards and why I sort of lost interest towards them, and I made it mostly for myself to preserve the memories of the journey that I had before I forget them. But to my surprise, that video got quite a lot of traction, and immediately I started getting bombarded by keyboard companies wanting me to promote their keyboards. Most of them were basically no-name brands that were selling budget keyboards that didn't particularly offer anything special, and some of those brands also expected quote-unquote free promotion in the sense that they send you the cheap budget keyboard, and instead of an honest review, which they made clear that they aren't interested in, they expect you to drive up their sales by using their marketing, selling points, and so on. To be honest, I wasn't really interested in making a video reviewing any keyboards to begin with, let alone these ones that didn't really offer anything special or interesting. However, eventually I was contacted by a company called Lofree who offered me their brand new low-profile mechanical keyboard called the Lofree Flow in exchange for a video about it. This keyboard was actually somewhat interesting because it was a low-profile, modern mechanical keyboard with features such as being gasket-mounted, supposedly having smooth, custom low-profile switches, being wireless, having a metal case, and so on. I hadn't heard of low-profile mechanical keyboards since the Cherry ML switch keyboards that were designed for things like server racks and so on, and from what I remember, most people said that they were quite awful, especially because of the low travel distance, so low-profile mechanical keyboards have never been that popular, but that's exactly what made this keyboard interesting for me, mixed with a few other features that I don't have previous experience with, such as it being gasket mounted, so I decided that if I'm going to accept any of these offers whatsoever, it might as well be this one. However, the main reason I'm making this video at all is because it's my first time receiving a product sent for review, which I figured could be interesting, so I made it clear to the company that I'll only make a video if I can actually say whatever I want, and I won't do anything to boost sales other than just making the video however I feel like it. And they agreed, so eventually they sent me the keyboard, which arrived in a pretty nice, solid, fancy box. Now's the part where I say that I wasn't paid by the company and they don't get to see this video before it goes live and so on, so there is no way that I could possibly be biased, but in reality, in many of the cases where videos start off like this, the thing is that when you review a product that you received for free and say something negative about it, there is a high chance that either the same company that sent you the product or similar companies will no longer want to work with you because you essentially either decreased their potential sales or you just didn't increase them enough, which can be detrimental to channels that only do product reviews and depend on companies sending them new products for free and as soon as possible for that purpose. Luckily for me though, I'm actually not all that interested in making videos like this, and the reason why is because for every video I make, I'm going to lose the opportunity to make a different video instead. So if the product I received ends up being something that I'm not that interested in making a video about, I still have to make the video regardless, and in the process I'll be delaying or sacrificing some other video that I actually wanted to make, as well as unnecessarily tire myself by making a video with no incentive that I don't even want to make. But anyway, there actually are a few things that I'd like to mention when it comes to this product. So to start off the review, the first thing I took out of the box was the included cable, which at first sight I thought was kinda cool because it had this angled connector that said Lofree on it. However, this cable is really stiff to the extent that it's still bent out of shape from when I unboxed it, which makes the fact that the cable is angled a bit problematic. The angle might be good if you're using it in front of a laptop, but on a desktop, the angle just felt awkward, especially considering how stiff the cable is, so I pretty much just used a completely different cable instead of the included one whenever I use the keyboard in wired mode. Ideally, the best type of cable would be something like the ones that you see on modern gaming mice, such as the very soft braided cable on my Razer DeathAdder Mini, which is a rather high quality mouse that only costs 23 euros, so it shouldn't be that expensive to include a better cable for a keyboard that has an MSRP of $159, which also makes the fact that the cable is completely black instead of color matched even worse. Of course, you're mostly going to be using this keyboard on Bluetooth anyway, and you can use your own cable like I did, but that's also probably the mindset that led to the cable becoming seemingly just an afterthought. Of course, nobody is going to leave this keyboard unpurchased just because of the cable, but I find it a bit disappointing considering that the company focuses a lot on having these unique and interesting designs and aesthetics, which kind of leads you to expect that they'd also be particular about the cable, and since it's a USB-C cable, it's something that you will be able to use on other devices as well, not on just this keyboard alone, so it kind of feels like a missed opportunity to sprinkle a bit more passion into the product. Moving on to the keyboard itself though, my first impression when I took it into my hand was that despite it being a wireless keyboard, it's really light. It weighs 550 grams, which is almost the same weight as my HHKB Pro 1, which is also a really light keyboard, and as a comparison, my tiny homemade hand-wired keyboard weighs around 800 grams, and the even tinier Boker 3 that I had in the past, which had an actual heavy sturdy metal case, weighed around 850 grams. When it comes to weight though, while I definitely love high quality heavy solid keyboards, I also think that light keyboards have their place as well. For example, I constantly move my keyboard around my desk and slightly adjust its angle and whatnot depending on what I'm doing or as I adjust my posture, in which case being able to effortlessly move the keyboard around with just my fingertips becomes an advantage. Not to mention that this keyboard is definitely designed to be portable, in which case it being light can be desirable. That being said though, the fact that the keyboard is so light despite having a metal case probably also means that the materials just aren't that high quality, and indeed, the metal casing is quite thin and flimsy, making it one of those metals that at first sight makes you question whether or not it's actual real metal or just plastic with a silver coating. Personally, after having tried cheaper keyboards such as the Boker 3 as well as my own homemade keyboard and so on, this keyboard unfortunately didn't feel particularly premium at first sight, which also instinctively led me to try twisting it, and sure enough it has some level of flexion, and when you press on the keys hard, it does decompress quite a bit, although that also probably has something to do with the gasket mount as well. Essentially, this keyboard doesn't really feel like a solid brick, however, it's not really unacceptably bad either, considering that it's a portable, lightweight, low-profile keyboard, but if it were any more expensive than it already is, the build quality will definitely start to become disappointing. You can also probably tell how soft the material is just by looking at how the screws have depressed the metal, which kind of made me wonder if the case is easy to dent, and sure enough, a second later I noticed that this brand new keyboard that I just unboxed includes a slight dent on the bottom. Funnily enough, at first I didn't really check any reviews on this keyboard, so my first impressions and this review wouldn't be skewed by others, but I noticed that there is an unboxing of the same keyboard by Kairos22, and here are his first impressions.
But this is the first time I'm doing one with such an aluminium case, and man, this feels like plastic. They told me it was an aluminium case, so I'm not sure. This, man. Yeah, it scratches too. Is this really all aluminium? It feels so light. It has no weight to it. Is that ooh, is this a mark here? I think there's a tiny dent on the case at the bottom here, just under the O and W. Yeah, it looks like a small dent.
So clearly, I'm not the only one who had the same experience, as well as received a dented sample, and the interesting part is that the dent was almost at the same location for both of us, so there is most likely some kind of a quality control issue regarding that. In terms of the design, the brass hinges on the bottom are pretty solid, and so are the long rubber feet, which are also pretty grippy. On the side of the keyboard, there is this Lofree logo emblem. However, I noticed that on my sample, it's very slightly misaligned, as the gap on the bottom is slightly larger than the gap on the top, and for some reason there is also a gap between the top rim and the bottom plate of the case, and you can see the screws between the gap as well. While these things may seem a bit nitpicky, they are also the small details that make a big difference in terms of the perceived build quality, as it's kind of like those small details that give away whether or not some product is genuine or fake. In terms of the keycaps, I personally like their profile and font, but the texture is a bit on the finer side, so it isn't as rough as some other PBT keycaps, which is a matter of personal preference. However, they aren't the thickest keycaps in the world, and the backlight shines right through them and, in my opinion, looks pretty bad. The keyboard also has side lighting. However, I personally won't go any further in terms of the lighting on this keyboard for the simple reason that I personally had it off the entire time, so if you do want to learn more about the lighting, you can check out other reviewers as well, as I'm sure there's someone who covered it more in depth. But anyway, this was my first time actually trying out the switches on this keyboard. as you can probably hear, they sound quite nice, and I have nothing negative to say about the stabilizers either, which are definitely stable and quite smooth as well. These are linear low-profile switches made by XIII out of POM plastic, which are quote-unquote self-lubricating as they supposedly get smoother over time, presumably from the friction smoothing out the material. And while the switches definitely are smooth in the sense that they aren't scratchy, they are very quote-unquote steppy in the sense that when you press down the switch slowly, you can see and feel how it wants to get stuck all the time. I think this phenomenon is also referred to as stiction, and even though I've been using this keyboard daily for around 2 months now, that aspect is still just as bad as it was on day one, so I wouldn't particularly say that they've gotten smoother compared to the beginning, which leads me to believe that if the self-lubricating aspect is actually valid, then it's most likely going to take years, and it's going to be inconsistent based on whichever keys you use the most regardless. The switches are also quite stable as they don't have much wobble, and the keyboard is hot swappable, but it's only compatible with these specific low-profile switches, so I still can't try the Akko switches that I bought some months ago. But anyway, the typing feel is an aspect I value greatly when it comes to keyboards, and I'll be honest, this keyboard feels surprisingly good. It's one of the best feeling non-Topre keyboards that I've tried, and while the travel distance is lower than on most keyboards, surprisingly, it isn't as big of a deal as I expected. If anything, it introduces a new kind of a flavor in terms of the typing experience. The force curve of these switches isn't super flat, but due to the short travel distance, you pretty much bottom them out instantly anyway, so there isn't much chance for the increased resistance on the bottom to become that noticeable. And what's particularly noteworthy is that, most likely because of the casket mount, bottoming out on the keyboard feels distinct and noticeable, but also kind of soft in the sense that you can slightly feel the plate reverberating as it swallows the force of the keystroke, which is slightly similar to bottoming out with the case-mounted switches of the HSKB. To be honest, at first I felt a bit conflicted over this, as in some ways it feels a bit cheap, as if it were a rattly, shabbily built budget keyboard that isn't super solid, but the more I used it, the more it started feeling like an intentional characteristic rather than an unwanted side effect, but it's definitely a matter of preference. Personally, I do find it pretty interesting and pretty fun to type on, but I feel like I'd enjoy both ends of the spectrum as long as they're both well executed. If I had to describe how this keyboard feels and sounds using only one word, there is this specific, almost perfectly fitting word that has unfortunately been overused ad nauseum to the extent that I'm not even going to use it, so just listen to what it sounds like and decide for yourself. Overall, I think it's a surprisingly good sounding and feeling keyboard, but I feel like it could be a bit better if it didn't have that previously mentioned steppiness issue, which might be something you could solve by lubing these switches, but unfortunately I am unable to confirm it as I don't have any lube. However, this keyboard has one enormous issue, which is that it's not programmable, meaning that you are stuck with the default layout as you cannot remap the key locations. Now, depending on who you are, this might not bother you at all, but for me, it's kind of a deal breaker because there are a few certain remaps that I prefer on all of my keyboards. For example, I want the caps lock to be a control key, the pipe key to be the backspace, and the backspace to be the pipe key. As for the latter, the reason why is simply because otherwise my pinky finger can't reach the backspace unless I twist my wrist. I would also really like to remap the position of the function key as well as the home and end keys and so on, but unfortunately with this keyboard I cannot do that. So after nearly 2 months of using this keyboard, I'm still not perfectly used to the layout, and in some ways I'll never be completely satisfied with it because I know that it could be objectively, subjectively better for myself, but it never will be. I also reached out to Lofree regarding this issue, and they mentioned that they will try to make future iterations of the keyboard programmable, but unless there's going to be a backwards compatible firmware update, then the current model probably won't receive programmability. In terms of the overall usability of the low profile, as I said, I've used this keyboard for around 2 months now, and going back to higher profile keyboards feels pretty awkward now, in the sense that I've gotten used to not needing to float my hands or bend my wrist in order to type, and it's also pretty easy to go from your mouse to the keyboard without having to lift your hand, which in a way can be pretty nice. You're also easily able to glide your fingers over the keys and whatnot, but sometimes I find it a bit hard to tell when my hand has slipped to a different row or column of keys, which can lead to lots of typos and other frustrations during activities such as programming, and especially in gaming where you have lots of different key bindings that you want to be very confident with. Usually, I get used to different mice and keyboards quite quickly, but even after 2 months of daily usage, with this keyboard I still find myself making some mysterious typos that I just didn't really make all that often before, especially ones such as hitting the next key before the first one during fast inputting, and I assume the short travel distance has a lot to do with it. I was also wondering what would happen if I put higher profile keycaps onto this keyboard, but right away the low travel distance combined with the taller keycaps just felt super weird, and it seemed as if these switches kind of stretched the stems of my old Enjoy BBT keycaps, so I decided to stop there. The keyboard of course has Bluetooth support, so it can be used wirelessly, and when typing, the latency isn't really all that noticeable, and I don't think anyone will complain over it, but I still wouldn't use it wirelessly for something like competitive gaming, because there still is a slight input delay. I went ahead and reached out to Lofree about the Bluetooth mode, and they said that the frequency is 125 Hz as well as that the input delay is 200 milliseconds, but I assume that that is the worst case scenario, as 200 milliseconds will be incredibly high and noticeable, and through my testing it was more like 8 milliseconds. However, as they mentioned, the final latency can depend on many factors. This is also my first time using a wireless mechanical keyboard, and while I can definitely live without it, I suppose it's nice to not have to worry about an additional cable dangling in the way and being able to quickly clear my table if I want to record a video or something. You can apparently also connect to multiple devices at once and switch between them with function plus 1, 2 or 3, which I can imagine being quite handy for certain people using multiple devices at once, but personally I don't really run into such scenarios very often. So anyway, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about this keyboard, and whether or not I think it's worth buying is really up to you. It's not particularly super cheap, but it's not really that expensive either, as it does offer niche features and characteristics all in a single, quite unique package. Other low-profile keyboards such as the Lofree Air series are probably pretty strong competitors, but I haven't tried them, and they're most likely still going to both have their own subjective pros and cons. Personally, I definitely do like the way the keyboard feels, and when you combine that with the low profile, it definitely makes this keyboard into a very unique and fun experience, but the fact that it's not programmable is still a huge disadvantage for myself personally. Overall, if you're shopping for a new keyboard, keep in mind that there also are tons of decently priced, really good and high quality second-hand keyboards for sale as well, especially in forums such as Geek Classifields, Destority, r/Mech Market, and so on. So that's pretty much all I had to say for this video, and I'll most likely see you in the next episode of the Store Renovation series.